Ladies and gentlemen, please switch off your mobile phones. The film is about to start. It wouldn't be a bad idea, actually, to switch it off more often.
Wir haben gezeigt, dass hochfrequente elektromagnetische Felder die Gene schädigen können.
Das ist wahrscheinlicher als nicht, dass durch Mobiltelefonieren Hirntumore hervorgerufen werden.
We have to find ways to use this technology safely.
We found out that most of the phones are very much out of the compliance.
Hier wird versucht, einfach eine Forschung im Keim zu ersticken.
We've been seeking in excess of $150 million.
I think this industry is too big to fail.
The cell phone industry has developed at incredible speed. Today, it's one of the largest and most powerful industries in the world. The figures speak for themselves. In 1993, just 34 million cell phones were in use. 20 years later, we have more cell phone contracts in the Western world than people, an increase of 6.8 billion until 2013. The levels of radiation from mobile communications have increased proportionately and continue to do so. When radiation comes into contact with the human body, it's absorbed by tissue. To protect people from increased radiation, a threshold value was established, SAR, the specific absorption rate. According to the usage manual for mobile phones, keeping this threshold value under 2 watt per kilo guarantees our safety, provided a distance of 1.5 centimeters from the body is maintained. For further SAR information, we have to take a look at a website. Here we find an informational video. Let's see if this film explains why we have to keep our phones 1.5 centimeters away from our bodies.
Mobile Kommunikation hat unser Leben verändert. Sie ermöglicht höhere Produktivität und Mobilität und führt zu mehr Sicherheit. Dieses Video ist eine Einführung darüber, wie die zuständigen Experten und Behörden die Sicherheit von Funkanwendungen sehen. Die Frage nach möglichen gesundheitlichen Risiken durch Funkwellen wird bereits seit vielen Jahren intensiv wissenschaftlich untersucht. Die Hersteller konstruieren und testen ihre Produkte so gründlich, dass alle erforderlichen Sicherheitsrichtlinien eingehalten werden. Weltweit hat kein wissenschaftliches Gremium und keine Aufsichtsbehörde die Schlussfolgerung gezogen, dass Mobilfunkfelder ein gesundheitliches Risiko darstellen. Machen Sie bis dahin unbesorgt Gebrauch von der mobilen Kommunikation und genießen Sie alle Vorzüge, die Ihnen diese bietet.
The consumer still doesn't know why he has to observe this safe distance, but can feel reassured now, right? Unfortunately, my own research was rather disturbing. I'd heard of brain tumor patients in the US who were suing the entire mobile phone industry for damages. I'll never forget the 5th of February 2005, the day on which I was finally able to reach a private investigator, Bob, in the USA. It was he who ensured I would be unable to let this go. Bob had done research on behalf of a law firm and wanted to share some explosive documents with me. Most of the papers were marked confidential and were registered as evidence. Motorola, the American cell phone pioneer, had apparently fudged their SAR tests in the 90s. The head of the research department had confirmed that all phones were within the American SAR limits of 1.6 watt per kilo. However, the Motorola test report lists values of up to 2.21 watt per kilo. In other words, Motorola had sold illegal products on the market. But that wasn't all. Motorola had probably known about the risks of increased radiation, so they'd submitted a patent application for an antenna shroud. Their main competitor at that time, Nokia, followed suit, registering and patenting a complete radiation shielding apparatus for mobile phones. The patent application includes this explanation. It has been suggested that radio frequency irradiation may stimulate extra growth among supportive cells in the nervous system, which, in the worst case, it's been suggested could lead to a development of malignant tumors, e.g. glioma from supportive cells. The patent application also states that, although the consequences described above have not been scientifically verified, the uncertainty has some effects, e.g. by reducing the speed of growth of the market of radio phones. Bob promised me further documents, and we arranged a meeting in Baltimore. I still remember this moment very clearly. I was very nervous as I neared the meeting with Bob in Baltimore. But at the same time, I felt sure I was on the track of an exclusive story. Incidentally, I've never been an opponent of mobile phones. I would even say that in the eyes of the industry, I was an exemplary frequent user. The Harbour Court Hotel, where I met Bob in February 2005, a large box which seemed deserted then. Bob wanted to remain absolutely anonymous. He was frightened. He told me that the opponent was unpredictable. Then he handed me over several documents, the first of which a key document known to insiders as the War Game Memo. Marked confidential, it came from one of the largest and most controversial PR agencies in the world, Burson Marsteller, often called the Masters of Manipulation. Motorola had commissioned this strategy paper from the lobbyists after American researchers had discovered so-called DNA strand breaks triggered by cell phone radiation, the precursor to cancer. These findings were bad for business. Counter-strategies were required. The instructions of the lobbyists became more and more apparent to me. To undermine research which identifies problems. To discredit scientists as incompetent. All studies have to be reproduced. Only finance and control own research. Contest any allegation of health risk. As we'll see, this wargame strategy still works today. Problems discovered by research are downplayed, and consumers are reassured through the media. There is no problem with mobile phones. Already in the 1990s, the topic of health risks associated with mobile communications was an issue at the World Health Organization in Geneva. The powerful United Nations organization adheres to a very noble statute. Health is a fundamental human right. Everyone has the right to the highest possible level of health. The visit to the WHO was my first research trip into the topic of mobile phones. The trip was because of the Australian Dr. Mike Repacholi. He had attracted my attention because, as a mobile communications researcher in Australia, he'd found problems which he then, as a project manager for electromagnetic fields at the WHO, had interpreted differently.
My study was looking at transgenic mice that were predisposed to get lymphoma, and we found an increase in lymphoma from the radio frequency signals. And we spent 6 months going through that study to find out what we did wrong, because we thought, heavens, we don't know why there should be an increase in lymphoma, and we still don't know.
The scientist questions his own research and even goes a step further.
No one is immune from something going wrong within a study, or a study producing results that are totally unexpected. So this is why WHO has a rule that before something can be used in a health risk assessment, that we have to replicate that study.
There it was again, the magic word.
Have to replicate that study.
Later, having seen the Wargame memo, I was better able to understand Dr. Repacholi's statements. The instructions of the industry lobby were apparent in his questioning of his own research. Next logical step, an all-clear signal.
Mobile phone users just want to know, is it safe to use a mobile phone? And we say, from all the evidence we have, and we've accumulated a large number of studies now, because of this research that's been ongoing, we have not found any evidence to suggest that these phones are not safe.
That was the official position of the World Health Organization, presented and disseminated by a man who denied his own findings. In his role as WHO project manager for electromagnetic fields, the Australian toured the world for 10 years, pronouncing the harmlessness of mobile phones. I then wanted to ask the Australian where the funds came from. The answer was quite revealing.
Your budgets, where do they come from?
We have budgets that come from national governments, professional societies and industry. But the funding that comes from industry has to go into a separate pot, and then it's provided to WHO. We have a collaborating institution that will collect funds from all over and then just provide the money from WHO, and we don't need to know where it came from, or will we allow any influence from donors. So it's very important that we're not tainted by industries.
That Dr. Mike Repacholi was not himself untainted was discovered by an American journalist, Louis Slessin, who had already been recognized as potentially dangerous in the Burson-Marsteller wargame plan. On the 5th of July, it was made public that Dr. Mike Repacholi, coordinator of the Radiation and Environmental Health Unit of the WHO, had received $150,000 a year directly from the cellular phone industry, plus additional funds for events, travel costs and fees. He had broken the rules of the WHO, which prohibit the receipt of money directly from industry. Dr. Repacholi didn't deny it. He retired from WHO in 2006 and works, now at least officially, as an industry consultant. He was actually one of the main instigators behind the introduction of SAR values in Europe. To position him at the WHO as the voice of reassurance was a tactical masterstroke by the cell phone industry. But who actually makes up the mobile phone industry? Well, there is a powerful industry association, the CTIA, based in Washington, D.C. The CTIA is an organization of all the major industry players, to which the most significant companies from wireless communication were added a few years ago. As a result, the association is now called CTIA, the Wireless Association. In 1993, it was the CTIA which initiated the largest mobile phone research program ever, with a budget of $25 million. In the summer of 2005, I was introduced to the man who the CTIA selected for the research assignment. Dr. George Carlo. The medical scientist and lawyer founded the Wireless Technology Research Institute, WTR. He was supposed to supply scientific proof that cell phones are harmless. But the industry chose the wrong man, someone who still works to uncover the truth today.
You have studies that show problems or potential problems and studies that are inconclusive. Now, the industry spins the science, and they put it out there for public consumption as though these studies are evidence of safety. It is scientific fraud.
Dr. Carlo knows what he's talking about. The problems which he and his teams found were supposed to have been covered up, but instead Carlo went public. On the 20th of October 1999, ABC's popular evening news led with his findings.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We're going to begin this evening with a subject that sooner or later occurs to millions of people who use cell phones. Are they safe? Can you get cancer from a cell phone because it's so close to your head? Almost 400 million people in the world, 80 million people in the U.S. are using cell phones now. The cell phone industry has always said they're safe. But now, in an exclusive report compiled by ABC's Brian Ross, the man who was in charge of the industry research program says this is not necessarily so.
6 years after the cell phone industry gave him $25 million for scientific research it hoped would prove cell phones safe, Dr. George Carlo has come to this conclusion.
We've moved into an area where we now have some direct evidence of possible harm from cellular phones. I'm on this thing every day.
Breaking ranks for the industry and incurring criticism even from one of his own colleagues on the study. Dr. Carlo tells ABC News research he oversaw suggests two potential problems: genetic damage, which can be a precursor to cancer and other diseases, and an increased risk of a rare type of brain tumor.
Going public was always going to bear a price. George Carlo could roughly guess what would happen if he started a fight with the giant, but not really.
When those first findings came through, I was first concerned about, okay, this is not good for consumers. There are a couple 100 million people out there using these things, and this does not look good. But I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that I also became concerned about myself, because I knew that going public and sort of standing behind the science that we had conducted, and this was very, very good science, was going to change the way I was perceived in public. I knew it was going to end my research career, and it did. I didn't expect that it was going to have the impact on, the impact on my family. And I think that Life has been very different because of it. But there's nothing I would do differently. Just shortly after we had the first findings that were negative and began talking about them, my house out on the Chesapeake Bay was set on fire, burned to the ground. The authorities concluded that it was arson. Never been able to solve who did it.
Dr. George Carlo disappeared for a time, continuing to work unnoticed behind the scenes. In the summer of 2005, he took me to meet his new employers, the prestigious law firm Morgenroth and Morgenroth. This law firm, by now in charge of the largest compensation proceedings ever against the mobile phone industry, had made a brilliant and delicate move by engaging Dr. George Carlo as a consultant. The legal action wasn't only directed against various mobile phone manufacturers such as Motorola, but also against Dr. Carlo's former employer, the Global Industry Association, the CTIA.
A rapidly growing tumor that Dr. Bratbard...
With Dr. George Carlo on the team, the law office was prepared to invest millions of dollars in the lawsuits. In the American legal system, the plaintiffs' lawyers are expected to invest their own money in a case.
I know the European system also is where the loser pays all the fees as well. We don't have that system ordinarily here. So you have to be well funded, and you have to be able to, shall we say, prosecute your case to its finality. And you have to know you'll be able to do it before you take the case, because the defense has to know you can do it. If they think that you are reluctant to proceed to the end, or if they think, as I said before, that you're not funded, or you don't have the expertise or the firepower, that's a wonderful weapon for them. So you have to understand that you're not going to be able to persevere unless you have those weapons.
With the consultant Dr. Carlo as a secret weapon, the law office invested in 6 brain tumor cases, 6 Americans who traced back their cancer back to their frequent use of mobile phones. The first claim, filed in 2001, generated a high level of media interest.
The latest controversy involving cell phones and brain cancer is unfolding here in Chicago. It centers around the story of a cell phone technician who spent the better part of a decade working with dozens of cell phones for hours a day. And now he is alleging it is the tools of his trade that caused his brain cancer. You are looking at an X-ray of the brain of Michael Murray. The white mass to the right is the cancerous tumor he had removed. Murray was a cellular technician for Motorola.
Is there any doubt in your mind that your work with cell phones caused your brain tumor?
I have no doubt of is the use of the cellular phone at work, because I would put it to my left ear.
To compound matters, Michael Murray often tested the cell phones at peak signal strength with a signal booster for hours at a time.
That would put the phone at maximum power. That would be the highest power level.
And like the others, Michael Murray believes the cellular phone industry has placed profits ahead of its public responsibilities.
I feel they know. They have to.
In this fact statement to the I-Team, a cell phone industry spokesman states there is no public health threat from the use of wireless phones. He points to the industry's $25 million 5-year commitment to study the issue.
The deliberate misrepresentation of his findings was something that Dr. George Carlo knew very well.
In many cases, what was presented by the WTR in terms of findings and significance was represented differently by the industry, where we would have a press conference. The industry then got to the point where they would schedule a press conference to compete with our press conference. So they would tell the media, this is what they said, but this is what they really meant.
The lawyers interpret these connections as deliberate misrepresentation. Deliberate misrepresentation is therefore an essential point for the prosecution. The research findings, which were collected by Dr. George Carlo over 6 years, could prove very expensive for the mobile phone industry.
In each case, we've been seeking in excess of $150 million.
Why that high?
Well, these are serious injuries that are causing damages both to loss of income, to medical bills, and as well as pain and suffering. So those categories, we think that based on these severe injuries, that there should be severe damages. In addition, can get special damages of punitive or exemplary damages, which are because of the seriousness of the intentional acts of the cell phone industry. We're alleging that they intentionally misrepresented, misled these plaintiffs as well as the public by indicating that there was no negative or ill effects of cell phone usage when in fact they knew that that wasn't true. So we are also seeking these special damages because of the seriousness of their intentional tortious acts.
A Hollywood actor by the name of Dino Schofield is also among the clients of Morgenroth & Morgenroth, a law firm with the reputation for representing David in his fight against Goliath. Dino had to give up his promising career after surgery to remove a brain tumor the size of a baseball. Schofield survived the operation, but remains at mortal risk. Dino Schofield, too, was a frequent user. The tumor developed on the side of his head where he held his mobile.
I am right-handed. I always had the cell phone on my right-hand side. I've been a cell phone user since they came out with the old shoebox.
If his lawyers can prove that the radiation from his mobile phone led to Dino's cancer, this could cause an avalanche of lawsuits. One single $150 million victory for the plaintiffs could bankrupt an entire industry.
In our work.
Now it's still David against Goliath, but these lawyers wouldn't litigate such a long, expensive and complex cause against such a powerful industry if they weren't in possession of clear evidence. In George Carlo's Wireless Technology Research Institute, everything was neatly recorded and documented.
These are all the documents that have been accumulating since 1993, and we're making sure that they're all kept in a very safe place. Of course, it's important because these documents are going to be critical to the litigation, to the behavior of how certain people acted during that time. But more importantly, it's important to have a history of what happened over the past 15 years with regard to this very important issue.
Dr. Carlo's documents represent in some way the history of mobile phone communication research. A lot of work for the court covering a long period of time. A piece of video documentation from the past, Rome, November 1995. Dr. Carlo had invited experts to the first International Mobile Communications Congress of his WTR.
The theme bringing us together for the next 3 days is at once simple and complex. I believe that we all share a common interest in identifying public health problems associated with wireless communication technology and in prescribing and implementing workable solutions to those problems.
Identify problems, develop solutions. Already in 1995, Dr. Carlo saw his research assignment pragmatically. But it became more and more clear that the industry was not interested in solving the problems identified. problems some of which were outlined by Professor Om Gandhi in Rome back in 1995. For the first time, he used computer tomography to display the depth of the cell phone radiation penetration. The younger the child, the more deeply cell phone radiation penetrates the skull. Children have a softer pinna, a thinner scalp, and a thinner skull bone, absorbing significantly more radiation. The SAR limit does not take this into account, which is why researchers were already worried about young mobile phone users back then. In some countries, this sensitive issue concerning children is receiving more attention.
This is the way we go to school, go to school, go to school. This is the way we go to school on a cold and frosty morning. This is the way we use our phones, use our phones, use our phones. This is the way we use our phones on a cold and frosty morning.
This is the way we dose ourselves, dose ourselves, dose ourselves. This is the way we dose ourselves with microwave radiation. This is the way the tumor grows, tumor grows, tumor grows. This is the way the tumor grows, time to heed the warning.
Radiation is invisible. Only the success of the industry is visible. The technological revolution rolls on unstoppably, and people are in love with their smartphones. Julia, a 20-year-old student from Vienna, is a typical, constant, all-round user of today's world. She's had a mobile since she was 8, and over time her usage has increased with the arrival of the modern mobile, the smartphone. As an early adopter of this technology, she operates her mobile with amazing dexterity. However, the young people of today must be careful that their mobiles don't end up controlling them. FOMO, the fear of missing out, is now a widespread phenomenon. According to a British study, today's average mobile phone user looks at their mobile 285 times a day. The figures from studies in Germany and America are similar. Even while meeting family and friends, mobile phones stay on. It's become increasingly seldom to switch off. It took 8 long years for the legal dispute at the civil chamber in Washington, D.C., the D.C. Superior Court, finally to result in further development. 8 years during which Dr. George Carlo had tirelessly pulled strings behind the scenes. 8 years of continuous exchange of confidential information with me. 8 years during which the largest, most expensive law firms in the United States tried in vain to hinder the brain tumor litigation in the United States. For the mobile phone industry, the events in Washington are about survival. Insiders speak of $1 million a day in costs and fees for the industry's renowned global law firms. During that time, over 100 top lawyers have tried to present new so-called proof of the harmlessness of mobile phone use. It is the most significant compensation litigation of all time, comparable with the lawsuits against the tobacco industry, only larger. Not everybody smokes, but everybody has a mobile phone. I finally met Dr. George Carlo again at the beginning of December 2013.
Hey, George. How are you, my friend? Welcome to Washington. Thank you. Come in. Good.
So, George, now 8 years after our first interview in Washington, D.C., and unbelievable evolution of a technology that now has reached like 6 billion people around the world. At this time, we were talking about 1.4 billion people. Many of the people use 2 phones. In the Western countries, we have like more phones than members of the population. It's incredible, and maybe they already won. The industry won.
Well, I mean, the impact, of course, you know, those devices change lives, most lives for the better. You know, people run businesses from those devices. So the simple phone that we were studying back in the 90s doesn't even exist anymore. You know, it's so that the force of the technology has really imprinted itself in everything around the world, in business and politics and education. So this is one of the reasons why something like this litigation, there's so much inertia, because you're up against forces that are unprecedented.
Of course, none of the scientists is so unworldly not to have noticed people's ubiquitous fascination with mobile communication. But unfortunately, there is another side to the coin.
Cancer is a group of over 100 diseases characterized by abnormal, uncontrolled cell growth. In a healthy body, cells grow, die, and are replaced in a very controlled way. Damage or change in the genetic material of cells by environmental or internal factors sometimes results in cells that do not die and continue to multiply until a mass of cancer cells or a tumor develops. Most cancer-related deaths are due to metastasis, malignant cells that penetrate into the circulatory system and establish colonies in other parts of the body. Great advancements have been made, but cancer is still the leading cause of death for people under the age of 85. In the United States, 1 in every 4 people die from cancer.
Really, Klaus, you have like a dichotomy. You have the truth of the matter is sort of in the gray area, and you have one opinion on one side, which is that there are some serious dangers here, and you have another opinion on the other side, which is there are no problems. And what gets reported to the public is that you have 2 differing opinions. Therefore, they cancel each other out, and there's not a problem. That's not the case. We know that there are effects. You know, there are thousands and thousands of people around the world who are electrosensitive. There's no doubt that there's a link between these, you know, information-carrying radio waves and the symptoms of electrosensitivity. There's no question about that.
To eliminate all doubts in court, Dr. George Carlo had begun to assemble a team of experts early on, which is how he met the German senior coordinator of the so-called reflex study for the first time.
Professor Edelkoff. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Good to see you. It's a pleasure.
So, I've heard a lot about you,
well,
and it's a pleasure for me to meet you here to talk with you.
The laboratory of the Medical University of Vienna published alarming findings in 2004. Cell phone radiation can damage structure and function of human genes, already far below the legal SAR limits of 2 watts per kilo. The reflex study clearly demonstrates that the legal SAR limit was not adequate to protect consumers. The damage to DNA more or less provided confirmation of Dr. Carlo's research.
Sometimes, some of these genes undergo a change. The nucleus then sends out abnormal orders and the cell goes wrong. It multiplies uncontrollably and takes on a life of its own. Each new cell produced contains the same defect. The cells proliferate chaotically and form a tumour. This process may be short, but is often long. 10 to 30 years may separate the birth of a first abnormal cell from the appearance of a tumour of about 1 cubic centimetre.
The researchers were agreed back then that action needed to be taken urgently for the protection of consumers, but the mobile phone industry preferred to conduct research according to its own rules.
If we cannot change the ratio between industry-controlled research and independent research, not much can be changed. It will go on another 10, 15 years. And if we are unlucky, very unhappy situation, then the problem cannot be hid anymore because the interval is long enough to show whether the cancer rate, the brain cancer rate increases or not. But what a catastrophe that we are in the position to run with open eyes into a field experiment, not knowing the possible outcome. Isn't that a catastrophe?
In the same year, Professor Adelkofer brought me to Vienna to introduce me to his fellow researcher, the occupational physician, Dr. Hugo Rudiger. The two experienced researchers were surprised that the warnings of their reflex study had not been taken seriously.
Wir haben gezeigt, aufgrund der Reflexdaten, dass hochfrequente elektromagnetische Felder die Gene schädigen können. Wir können nicht mehr sicher sein, dass nicht doch eben Schäden auftreten, die zu einer Gefährdung der Gesundheit der Handybenutzer führen. Wir können gegenwärtig nicht ausschließen, ob nicht in 15, 20 Jahren die Häufigkeit von Hirntumoren deutlich ansteigt.
Nehmen wir doch die Hinweise bei den elektromagnetischen Feldern jetzt ernst und warten wir nicht noch 40 Jahre, bis wir vielleicht was sehen.
The warnings of the scientists annoyed the industry. It was a clear message. Maybe too clear? The follow-up study to reflex was not approved. There was even an unprecedented smear campaign against the scientists. The Austrian capital suddenly plays a special role in the worldwide relevant mobile phone communications trials. Behind the scenes of this beautiful city, there are several ticking time bombs. First, there was the so-called Viennese scandal. In 2008, the German news magazine Der Spiegel devoted 2 articles to an alleged forgery scandal. The reflex study and Professor Rudiger's name were dragged through the dirt. He was alleged to have had an affair with his lab assistant, who then manipulated the data out of love for the professor. A fictional story, but only one journalist uncovered this character assassination, Tina Goebel from the Vienna-based news magazine Profil. She exposed this smear campaign, which had nothing to do with science.
Das ist ein Wahnsinn, finde ich, dass da Leute mit wirklich schweren Vorwürfen konfrontiert werden. Und also man sieht, dass dieses Thema Mobilfunk, es bleibt nicht bei der Wissenschaft und da wird nicht mehr sachlich diskutiert, sondern da wird wirklich, das geht sehr schnell ins Persönliche, da werden sehr schnell Geschütze aufgefahren. Da wird sehr schnell versucht, einfach auch das Privatleben von Wissenschaftlern zu zerstören.
Her article Strahlenschmutz uncovered this scandal, much to the amazement of many fellow journalists.
Das fand ich auch interessant, dass auch international andere Journalistenkollegen das sehr verwundert waren, dass ich überhaupt so einen Artikel, so einen kritischen schreiben kann.
Critical journalism seems to exist still in Vienna. Tina Goebel was able to work her way into this difficult subject and investigate thoroughly.
Die Forscher, mit denen ich gesprochen habe, die finde ich deswegen wirklich seriös, weil sie sind sehr kritisch und das sind keine Menschen, die jetzt hergehen und sagen würden, okay, die Handys bringen uns alle in 10 Jahren um. Was nicht sein kann, ist, dass man Forschung stört, aus Angst, dass das Ergebnis einem dann schaden könnte. Ja? Also hier wird versucht, einfach eine Forschung im Keim zu ersticken. Das finde ich wirklich schwer bedenklich.
Tina Goebel belongs to those experienced journalists who receive confidential information from a broad network of contacts. She's aware that the litigation against the mobile phone industry has entered the last round and that 2 scientists from Vienna play key roles in it.
Ich bin auch sehr gespannt, was bei diesem Prozess herauskommt. Ich kenne ja diese Protagonisten jetzt schon seit Jahren und habe miterlebt, wie es denen erging. Und weiß auch von Forschern, die wirklich da auch dran waren, die gesagt haben, ich möchte nie wieder irgendwas mit Handystrahlung forschen, denn wenn ich da drauf komme, dass das gesundheitsschädlich ist, dann zerstört mich die Lobby. Also da gibt es wirklich schon seitens der Wissenschaftler Bedenken, die einfach diese Forschung nicht mehr anrühren wollen. Das ist mittlerweile wie ein heißes Eisen, weil die Angst haben, dass sie da nicht nur wissenschaftlich, sondern auch teilweise persönlich zerstört werden, so wie man es da in Wien erlebt hat.
One of the Viennese scientists who still suffers as a result of the alleged forgery scandal is Professor Wilhelm Mosküller. The cancer researcher had to face accusations from the rector of his university because in the same Viennese lab he arrived at similar results as his colleague Dr. Rüdiger. Professor Mosküller is on the track of cancer risk caused by mobile phones. He's only able to continue his research because the General Accident Insurance Institution, AUVA, funds it.
Es geht hier nicht für oder gegen Mobilfunk. Es geht nicht um die Frage, ist es jetzt schädlich, ja oder nein. So kann man ein Problem nicht beantworten. Sondern es geht einfach darum, dass man die Dinge, die uns die vergangenen Experimente aufgetischt haben, verstehen lernt, indem man sie weiter nachuntersucht. Und da sind wir in Österreich sicher schon in einer besonderen Situation, weil ich ja weltweit registriere, dass die systematische Mobilfunkforschung abgedreht wird. Und wir haben hier quasi die besondere Situation, dass es hier noch weitergeht.
Professor Mosküller is only able to handle the hot iron of cancer and mobile phone communications because the AUVA continues to fund his research. His expertise is also required in the court in Washington.
Es gibt so viele Mechanismen, die zu Krebs führen, wie es Krebsvarianten gibt. Was aber wir sehen, sind DNA-Brüche. Und wir wissen, dass DNA-Brüche ein Risiko für die Zelle darstellen. Was uns noch fehlt, um den endgültigen Beweis zu haben, ist der Nachweis, dass spezifische Gene davon betroffen werden, sogenannte Onkogene oder Krebsschutzgene, wenn man sich den Mechanismus ansieht, nämlich dass DNA wahllos in Brüche gerät, ist es eine Frage der Zeit, bis auch solche Gene davon betroffen sind.
In the scientific search for cancer caused by mobile phone radiation, the team of Professor Mosküller is reinforced by an engineer of the AUVA, Dr. Hamid Molla Jafari, as well as the globally renowned head of the Institute for Environmental Hygiene at the Medical University of Vienna, Professor Dr. Michael Kundi. Professor Kundi has researched in the field of electromagnetic radiation at the University of Vienna for over 30 years. He, too, was called to Washington on account of his experience in this field. Within the framework of the risk studies, the funds from the insurance group enable the use of the latest methods from criminology, forensics. Dozens of saliva samples were taken from test subjects before and after exposure to mobile phone radiation in a lab. These samples should yield new findings about the changes of genetic imprints. Findings which Professor Kundi was able to define while under oath to the industry's defense lawyers with a clear conscience.
Meine Grundaussage war, dass es wahrscheinlicher ist als nicht, dass durch Mobiltelefonieren Hirntumore hervorgerufen werden.
The next trip was to meet another experienced scientist who will also testify in Washington. He conducts research at the Cancer Institute in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, with similar results as the Viennese team. We meet up with the Russian professor Igor Belyaev, a radiation expert who once conducted secret research on the effects of radiation for the government in Moscow. Later on, he went to the University of Stockholm. But after disagreements because of his critical attitude to mobile communication, he had to change to Slovakia. Here, he's surrounded by a team of young researchers and advanced computer systems that allow for targeted analysis in the field of cell research. Professor Belyaev, too, has experienced the discrediting of and interference in his work.
And do you think you can find safe?
Yes, but I think that it's a matter of huge state or multinational programs. It's not anymore a question of some specific or selected scientific teams. Because we know already too much. If you don't close our eyes just to reject information which we got already from different studies, we know already a lot to know that those effects exist. First of all, they are harmful in some cases, but in some specific conditions of exposure they are harmful.
Okay.
And the question is, what are the mechanisms, what are the consequences, and how to avoid this? And that should be solved in huge programs like state programs or multinational programs. And that was what I'm talking to you now. That was written by me in letter to the Swedish government in 2005, and after that later it's not already for filming.
Instead of following his recommendations, he was required to find a new job. Here too, the same pattern occurred. Researchers who could damage a growing industry were not wanted. On my next trip, I'm going to meet another highly qualified scientist who will also testify as expert for the plaintiffs. The Greek professor Dimitris Panougopoulos conducted research on cell phone radiation over the last few years and established a particular model in his studies. Due to the fact that the cell structure of a fruit fly is identical to that of a human, it's perfect for research. During its lifespan of a month, the fly goes through all relevant stages of life. It matures, it reproduces, and it dies, helpfully all within the convenient time frame of 4 weeks. Professor Panougopoulos uses the fruit fly in his research and has found genetically relevant cell change. I meet up with Dimitris Panougopoulos at the foot of the Acropolis. Like most people here, he's very attached to his home. He confides in me that he should actually leave Athens. He's been victimized because he published work critical of the health hazards of mobile phone communication. He still draws his salary as university professor, but he's no longer allowed to research. His findings are unwanted. In a recent scientific paper, Dimitris Panougopoulos, together with George Carlo and the Swedish professor Olle Johansson, had pointed out the absurdity of the SAR value designated as safety guideline by the industry.
Well, they've based the safety standards on the idea that the only effects are thermal effects. So they have set very high values to prevent the thermal effects, but the vast majority of the effects are non-thermal and they take place at much smaller intensities. And so the safety standards, they do not protect us from these non-thermal effects, because these effects, they take place at values within the current safety standards.
In fact, the professor has had a dream career. He's received many awards for his talent as a researcher. Cambridge University numbers him as one of the top 100 researchers in the world. Although his findings in the field of cell biology are groundbreaking, his expertise is not wanted.
We can clearly observe cell death, and also the finding that we have DNA damage and cell death during all developmental stages of early and mid-oogenesis. This was also a new finding.
It's increasingly clear to me that science is aware of the problem and is willing to cooperate. But the industry is unwilling to acknowledge either the problems or solutions. This would be an admission of guilt and thus a certain defeat in the ongoing lawsuits. In the background, a war of nerves is raging. The industry lawyers called on the court to exclude the experts from the trial, among other things on account of generally not accepted research methods. In Professor Moskula's case, they cited the Viennese scandal as an argument against him being called as an expert, despite the fact that 2 ethics committees had rejected the forgery allegations. However, all requests from the industry lawyers were overruled by the court in Washington. The team of experts could therefore prepare in peace for their summons in December of 2013. For me and my team, the trip to Washington was like a relief after the long period of waiting. The Venerable Frederick Meisberg, judge at the DC Superior Court, irrevocably disposed that the scientific hearing should take place in the first 3 weeks of December. He wanted to give the experts enough time to present their position under oath. A camera crew was not admitted at court. I was only allowed in the courtroom as an observer. 3 further law firms with 7 brain tumor cases had joined the plaintiffs. Class actions with thousands of victims are in preparation. The first expert who was questioned over 2 days in Washington was Professor Michael Kundi. He wanted to give us an interview after his final session, but was then advised by his lawyers not to do so. I was told that as litigation was ongoing, no one wanted to take any risks. There is too much at stake because the entire mobile phone communications industry was in the dock. The result of this hearing will affect the whole world of mobile phone communications. But aren't they too big to fail anyway?
I think this industry is too big to fail. You know, it isn't only the influence of the money of the industry or the financial power of the industry. It's what the technology has done to make people's lives better. I think that's a big deal. When you talk to people about their smartphone or their iPhone being dangerous, they're so dependent on those that they put up a shield. So it not only is the industry that is fighting the idea, it's also the individual users.
The next expert witness is Professor Moskala, who's arriving in Washington by train from New York. Like all the other experts for the litigation, Professor Moskala was advised not to get in contact with the other scientists. Theoretically, he could have read the testimony of his Viennese colleague, Professor Kundi.
Hatten Sie Gelegenheit, das mal zu lesen, was da jetzt protokolliert wurde von den 2 Tagen?
Nein, ich hab's am Schirm kurz gesehen. Ich habe bei Kunde kurz reingeschaut, aber allein Kunde-Transkript ist über 100 Seiten.
Ja, das denke ich mir.
Und ich habe WO gegeben, weil ich damit beschäftigt war, meine eigene Deposition noch zu studieren und zu lesen.
There are some of us who have been around the issue for 20 years, so that as new information comes out, we're able to assimilate it and integrate it over time. And that is something that is a much easier task than the judge has, because the judge has to figure this out. For some of us, we've worked on it for 20 years. There are others who have worked on it for 30, 40 years. The judge has to figure it out in 3 weeks.
Professor Moskala, too, was supervised and shielded by lawyers during the hearing. Generally, this event is being kept from public scrutiny. The press is unwanted. There is simply too much at stake. Worldwide, the industry has turnover of around $17 trillion. For our documentary, we invited some of the experts to a special hearing, one with the insider, Dr. George Carlo.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I just figured that Klaus would take me to a place where I'm surrounded only by Germans, including right there.
The rate of brain cancer has not increased now. If you believe the majority of the data, if you ask me, it's no point of making an epidemiological study right now, because if we talk about brain cancer, we expect it in 20 years from now, or 30 years from now. No one really knows the latency time from exposure to brain cancer, but I can smoke heavily today and will not have a brain cancer tomorrow or not the next year. So, being a heavy smoker, the latency time that applies to you is 30 years, 40 years. There is no point in making the argument we don't see the brain cancers rise. This is exactly what's so interesting about the question, or dangerous about the question. We see that the exposure now increases the risk for brain cancer by damaging the DNA in your brain. So the precautionary principle would be, do not expose your brain. You don't have to quit with your mobile phone, just quit with exposing your brain cells.
What I experienced during the hearings as a listener in the room made me feel rather optimistic. The judge is a veteran who won't be dazzled by the assembled powers of the industry's approximately 40 law firms. The war game memo is brought up in the courtroom. The steps outlined in the war game memo correspond with what happened to the experts present. That evening, a very special meeting takes place. Professor Dimitris Panagopoulos has always been a great admirer of Dr. George Carlo's work, but they had never met in person. Apart from the hearing, there was another first to come for the two scientists. Besides their fight for the truth, they have something else in common: their love for music. The next day, I met Dimitris in his hotel again after his first hearing. On our way to the Einstein Memorial, he described his appraisal of the hearing. The judge was very surprised that the scientists had been discredited for their findings rather than encouraged.
What they did to me, they were paying me to stay home, and when I started publishing again, then they attacked me. So I told Ms. Geller that if you have, some publications together, they will attack you. Take care.
And Beljaev is the same. Beljaev is in Stockholm.
He was in Stockholm and he had to leave and go, in Slovakia.
The concerns of the researchers had long become a highly volatile political topic, made difficult to address by the economic might of the mobile phone industry. Nevertheless, for George Carlo, the central issue remained the protection of consumers.
What do we need more to be able to protect the public?
I think that the authorities, politicians, they should listen more carefully. They should not ignore these matters.
Now, in Washington, the center of power, we have come full circle. Should Judge Weisberg at the Civil Chamber decide that the research must be taken seriously, this will have direct political consequences. Maybe now, on a judge's orders, scientific evidence would have to be taken seriously, whereas before it merely stood in the way of the growing mobile phone industry. Until now, where there was no problem, there was no need for solutions. 12 years after the filing of the suit of the long-dead brain tumor victim Michael Murray, the industry's house of cards could collapse right here in Washington, the place where so much history has been written.
At this level of our government, it's really about the influence of vested groups. And that's where the lobbyists come into play, the power of the industry money. And those people who are potentially harmed by cell phones and other wireless technology they're not a constituency that's large enough to have any political power.
In the summer of 2014, I went to the second largest city in France, Lyon, the city of the famous and imposing four-towered basilica of Notre-Dame de Fourvière. Another tower has been added, symbolizing the power of modern communication. Lyon is home to the International Agency for the Research of Cancer, IARC, an important branch of the World Health Organization. The principal task of IARC is the examination, evaluation and interpretation of worldwide cancer research, which is why the mobile communication topic ultimately reached Lyon. Researchers believe that 40 to 50% of all cancer cases could be averted if scientific findings also led to direct intervention. The findings from smoking are now crystal clear. Still, IARC did categorize mobile telephone use as possibly carcinogenic in 2011 in the so-called 2B category. The director responsible, the American-trained Dr. Kurt Streif, experienced firsthand how divisive this issue is during his 12-year career at IARC.
Hola, Dr. Streif, nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you for spending some time.
Please take a seat.
Thank you so much. Well, as you know, we have a very difficult issue, but a very sexy one as well. I can imagine that since 2011, you've had a lot of media contact.
Yes, indeed. This is a theme and a topic that is still very creating a lot of interest and a lot of heat. Yeah.
Do you see any change ever since you made the declaration of 2B?
There are certainly changes in so far that some national agencies, including here in France, for example, recommend to reduce the exposure, for example, in using hand-free kits. However, while the exposure levels go down, the usage is kind of exploding. There is often the citation that it's the heavy users that showed an increased risk of particularly that one type of brain cancer, glioma, and that was the highest 10% of the regular users. At that time of the Interphone study, making several assumptions, but on average one could say that was about a daily use of about 30 minutes. Now a daily use of about 30 minutes by today's means would be not considered the highest 10%, it's probably more the lowest 10% of the regular user.
The findings from Lyon, which classified the cell phone radiation as possibly carcinogenic, were also presented in Washington. But what does possibly carcinogenic even mean? At least a scientific risk had been officially evaluated and acknowledged for the first time. Ultimately, this is about consumer protection, or rather, consumer self-protection. How about this? We all support science with €1 per month.
That is one creative idea, and we know of all these other kind of additional surtaxes. If you buy a printer or if you buy a computer, you have to pay extra for use of media, replication of media. So perhaps that is one way, but one could of course also ask the governments to use tax money for research, or to ask the stakeholders, in that case the industry, to show that their products are safe.
The industry has never proved that their products are safe. On the contrary, the industry always made the consumer feel safe. There is hope that this will finally change through the litigation at the Washington, D.C. Superior Court. While the proceedings in Washington continue, and as yet no ruling has been issued, I flew to Oulu in Finland. A newly founded Finnish company has offered Dr. George Carlo the chance to join their scientific advisory board. The two founders, Pasi Niemi and Markku Kankala, were willing to supply information about a technical innovation which, according to George's interpretation, could help to defeat the industry with its own weapons. Oulu is considered as the information technology centre of Finland. It was home to the research institute of Nokia, the former world leader in cell phone manufacturing. Who doesn't remember the models from the heydays of success? But Nokia missed the development of smartphones and as a result sold its mobile phone division to Microsoft in 2014. The engineers had used existing expertise in Oulu. They wanted to reduce the radiation emitted by smartphones and so developed the first SAR software, which is able to measure the SAR values constantly. This testing procedure brought to light the fact that our mobile phones only comply with the threshold safety values in the lab.
When we then measure the SAR according to the specs, of course they were very much in compliance. But when we were measuring the SAR against the real use case scenario, we found out that most of the phones are very much out of the compliance. Even the phones that are clearly in compliance, when measured against the standard, can be 5 times higher than the SAR limits. That was a big shock for us.
Those measurements show the increase in the SAR values, especially disregarding the safety distance of 1.5 centimeters. Who maintains this distance anyway? Most consumers carry their device next to their body, exposing them to increased radiation. As their next step, the engineers focused on the development of a possible solution.
The solution is very simple. We're proactively monitoring the power level of the phone and how much it is radiating, if it is sending data. And if it looks like that the radiation levels will exceed, what we want them to be, we can simply cut off the data. So very simple example of this is that you have your phone in your pocket, you walk into an elevator, and you are about to receive an email. So now our software detects that, okay, you're in an elevator, the RF emission level would be higher than what you should be exposed to. So we cut off the data, and then once you step out of the elevator, we enable the data back on. So for you as a user, you just cut off one of those high radiating moments, and instead of getting email in the elevator, you are getting it 5 seconds after you step out of the elevator. So really, you're not giving anything away. It's just the software is cutting off and taking off those places where you would be exposed.
Whether in the future an app can actually protect us is still being determined. In any case, the Finnish test procedure could well defeat the industry using its own means. A certain George Carlo will make sure of that.
We need people like George Carlo to advise us and say that, okay, you should not be focusing on that because it's irrelevant. So we've been very pleased to work with him on this, and yeah, we have been consulting with him a lot on these things, and it's very interesting journey.
In the late summer of 2014, I came back to Washington. My informants had advised me to because something was going on. And indeed, on Friday, the 8th of August 2014, Judge Weisberg issued a ruling. Each brain tumor case has to be tried in front of a jury. The main charges are breakthrough after 20 years, which is how long this went on for George Carlo and his colleagues, from the first warnings of science to the confirmation before a court. Tragically, people had to suffer and die before anything changed. For me, the resolute researchers are heroes who didn't give in. With his ruling, the judge officially acknowledged their work and clears the way for a safer future for consumers.
Let's read a quote. I mean, it says, even though the financial and social cost of restricting such devices would be significant, those costs pale in comparison to the cost in human lives from doing nothing, only to discover 30 or 40 years from now that the early signs were pointing in the right direction.
There is a new chance to change the law.
Well, of course, because in our system, litigation, the results of litigation makes new law. What the judge has decided here in this order is new law.
Wow.
So new law is being made at every turn. We're very fortunate that what the judge is doing is making new law that makes sense. Because a lot of times when the judicial system legislates, we have mistakes. But in this particular case, because the legislative system has not taken this issue up, because the administrative or executive system has failed to protect the public, now we have a situation where this litigation and this type of judicial proceeding is necessary to protect the common good.
A courageous judge has set the course for the man who was selected by the industry some 20 years ago to reassure consumers and can now finish his job.
Que s'est-il passé depuis? Les avocats de l'industrie ont fait appel de la décision du juge. Ils ont demandé que soient réexaminées les études scientifiques existantes. Tout le monde est très agité. Suite à la dernière ordonnance du tribunal du septembre 2017, les scientifiques sont obligés de rendre publique leur correspondance avec moi et leur correspondance concernant le film. L'industrie cherche à gagner du temps pour protéger ses bénéfices au détriment de la santé de la population.
Maintenant, c'est à vous d'agir.
Alors, voici quelques recommandations. Première recommandation, ne jamais utiliser un téléphone portable à l'oreille plus de 20 minutes par jour. Utilisez le haut-parleur lorsque c'est possible. Deuxième recommandation, et elle est essentielle, interdire l'utilisation d'un téléphone portable chez les enfants de moins de 12 ans. Troisième recommandation, recommander aux femmes enceintes de n'utiliser un téléphone portable qu'en cas d'extrême urgence. Ne jamais utiliser un ordinateur connecté en Wi-Fi en période de grossesse et même restreindre l'utilisation de tout ordinateur après 3 mois. Quatrième recommandation, supprimer à domicile tout DECT, c'est-à-dire tout téléphone mobile, revenir au téléphone filaire. De même, préférer l'utilisation d'un ordinateur connecté en filaire plutôt qu'un ordinateur connecté en Wi-Fi. Cinquième recommandation, ne jamais téléphoner avec un téléphone portable dans un véhicule qui circule, qu'il s'agisse d'une voiture ou d'un train. Enfin, dernière recommandation, choisir un téléphone portable ayant un débit d'absorption spécifique la plus faible possible.